Welcome to Unbound, the podcast that explores the intersection of pop culture and the steamy world of romance literature. Join us as we celebrate the voices and stories often left in the shadows and unravel the threads of joy, passion, and heartache that keep us all coming back to the page and the screen. I'm Adriana and I write romance novels.
And I'm Nikki Payne, and I write ridiculous romance novels. Welcome to Unbound, a podcast where we dive deep into the unexplored terrains of romance subgenres through a BIPOC lens, unearthing histories and intertwining them with the broader cultural context of our time. As per usual, everything starts with a TikTok.
Dear Lord, what now?
Okay, so I'm on the Clock app, and a Black woman reader was posting about how she loves to read white books and that she just wants escapism. She doesn't want struggle. She doesn't want struggle love. And of course, she was dragged for filth. And everyone hopped on this and stitched her and was like, this is what you're thinking. This is why it's wrong. But I want to unpack that. I want to unpack that today. I think there's a lot of work.
There is a lot of unpacking to do there on that statement of the implication that reading a book that has a Black woman as a protagonist and is written, because I assume part of it is that it's been written by also a Black or brown woman, would implicitly mean that it's going to be a reading experience where there is a lot of trauma and there's just not the lighthearted fun that a person would expect when they're reading a romance novel. That's a lot. That's a lot to go into. So I think we can manage. I think we have the tools to do the unpacking. And it is something that I've been thinking a lot about this summer, in particular after attending Book Bonanza. And just like as a little explanation for those who don't know what Book Bonanza is. Book Bonanza is a very big reader and author event that has been hosted by Colleen Hoover, who we all know who she is. And Colleen has been hosting this event for many years. I think this was like the 8th year. It's been going on for a long time. And this was my first year going. It was the first year that I was invited. And so it was an interesting experience to me for me and for a lot of the other authors of color that I spoke with, which stood out to us that a large swath of the readership that were there, who were people of color, were by and large interested in books by white authors. To be fair, the readership that was there was about 1,700 readers. The majority of them were white, but there was quite a good portion of them who were people of color. And by and large, their focus was on white authors. So it was very noticeable to us.
When you say us, you mean the other authors of color.
The other authors of color, something that we discussed, that we observed. And like even yesterday, I was texting with another Black author, and she was asking me, like, are you thinking of going next year? And part of what I said is like, I'm not sure, because I don't know if that is our readership, which is sad to say, because there was a good portion of that readership that were people of color. But going back to the TikTok that we were initially discussing, especially because this idea that our books are not as desirable for escapist read, because naturally we would have heavy topics, is something that is really interesting to me, because a lot of the readers that I spoke with at Book Bonanza, in particular, and this is not like pointing out Book Bonanza, this also, like, I felt like this experience was similar to me, like, for example, in a Polycon, which I went to last year. And a lot of them told me that what they mostly read is dark romance, mafia romance, or like dark fantasy, which inherently is a kind of subgenre, is a subgenre that delves in a lot of heavy topics.
Pretty heavy.
There's a lot of graphic violence in these books. There's a lot of trauma that is experienced sometimes on the page by the female protagonist. A lot of these books, I mean, generally I'm talking about het books, but there's dark and fantasy with that are queer books as well. But thinking about like the idea that you're reading, you're reaching for books by white authors because you want that escapism. You don't want that heavy topic. You don't want that struggle love. And then, this like popularity of dark romance, which the ones I've read, and I don't read a lot of them are relationships with a lot of contention, because a lot of the times the hero begins as the villain.
Yeah.
Which begs the question, is it the heaviness of the topics or the reader's discomfort with confronting violence, or is it that there's a discomfort in having to read anything related to race in their romance?
Ooh.
Which I think is the unpacking that we would be doing today.
Oh, well, you all guessed it listening. We're talking about a hot topic that's been simmering in the book community: the politics of reading books by people of color. Okay, picture this. You're reading a delightful romance novel. Birds are chirping in the air. Someone is singing in the background. There's a dog barking. The characters are opening a charming Christmas tree farm. It sounds innocent, right? But guess what? Even those seemingly non-political stories are rife with politics. The politics that reinforce the rightness of the world as it is. Like everything's good, everything's fine.
And the politics that imply that for BIPOC authors and characters to be palatable, we have to strip away the layer of our experiences that others has. That for us to be a fun read, we have to remove our otherness. So for us to be an escapist read, we have to take away not perhaps violence that has been done to us, but the reason for that violence.
There we go. You know, when I think of escapist reads, me personally, I think of like time travel or sci-fi or historicals. People think about, hey, the historical has nothing to do with me. These are people in another time in a different place. And I know, Adriana, that you write historicals. Why do you think women read them?
I mean, it's kind of like a forked question, because I think right now the popularity of historicals is in decline. I think people are going to different types of genres, but I think in general, why historicals have always been popular, I think is because they've been super white. And I think it has been for a long time a very safe bet and of a read in which you will get a lot of fluff, you will get nice carriages, you will get, that
Costume.
ballroom, those, that like very masculine hero. And then you will have this, plucky heroine who is like standing up for herself, but all within a container that is very safely like not touching upon the more like problematic pieces of that society. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's been popular. And I think and there are authors who have like from the go have been like a lot more like stridently feminist in historical. And I think historical right now is some of the most feminist romance that is being put out, because
Absolutely.
it is really leaning into like a woman that is really trying to undo the patriarchy. Like if you talk, for example, to like an author like Sarah MacLean,
Knockout.
Yeah, Knockout.
Just read Knockout. Fantastic.
That entire series is amazing. But Sarah goes in with that hero really truly representing the patriarchy. And she goes in trying to undo it.
Yeah.
And so that it's a very different, I think that is why it's it's kind of an easier read for women who like a historical that is very feminist, because you can't, the urgency for those women to claim their rights, to fight for their position in the world, feels, I think, a little safer, because it's not making us confront perhaps the fights and the struggles that are present for us now, and that we perhaps don't feel prepared to go
Huh.
after.
And those fights and struggles are oftentimes full of much more nuance. And it's a little hard to actually wrap your hand around. And so oftentimes these historicals are seen as not political, but what really chafes me about labeling books by people of color as political is that one of the things that bothers me is I think we're indirectly affirming that those books written by the majority culture and about the majority culture are somehow neutral. It just gives this like cloak of invisibility on those stories. But again, guess what? That's wrong. Every book, no matter the genre or author, like they carry out a set of beliefs and values that shape our understanding of the world. Like every book, small or large, is coming to you with a point of view. And I think that's one of the things that I want to scream to the rooftops is that like that perceived safety of neutrality, of non politicalness is a facade. Everyone's telling you something. Everyone's whispering to you, right?
I mean, because the idea that you want to maintain a world that's free of anything that alludes to systemic oppression is really an endorsement of the status quo, which benefits some and harms a lot of others. And so
Come
that
on.
to me is like part of, and again, I think there's a shorthand in romance of subgenres that I think people consider like a fluffy, easy read. And I think what that translates to is books that are written without any kind of friction that might make the reader uncomfortable. Because again, going back to some of the themes that are very present in some of these, really popular dark romances, like not to say that you shouldn't read dark romance. I think people should read whatever they want, but I think we need to be a little bit more introspective in why it is that we are okay with reading books that have graphic violence on the page. Some of it, a lot of it, being perpetrated against women. And yet we cannot tolerate a small town romance that delves perhaps with a white politician who is a racist.
Come on.
Like we can't tolerate that. Like why is that? So when we are talking about small town romance, what is that shorthand for? What do you envision, Nikki, when you think of a small town romance?
I think of Gilmore Girls. I think of Stars Hollow, quaint cities, no people of color. There's a bakery. There's a struggling mom who's very rich but hates to be rich, right? I think of a kind of safety, right? That kind of like old time, nothing ever goes wrong.
Yes, it's a book that perhaps like reaffirms the innate goodness of the average person in like any town in America, that usually you have things about community, solidarity, people coming behind, the struggling diner, trying to build a new schoolhouse for the children. It's wholesome. It's feel good stuff that like just confirms to the reader that like any town in America is just like a great place to live, full of great people.
The Hallmark theory.
Yes, 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 the
Right?
Hallmark theory. And even when it has even a little bit of angst of heaviness, perhaps it's a person that's coming back to confront the demons of their past. There's some childhood trauma that they have to grapple with. They've reconnected with that first love that after some kind of like horrible incident they were torn from. So all of that is what you get. It's like the salt of the earth, right? When we say salt of the earth, the
Yeah.
thing that is the same for everybody. Anybody could find something to connect to, something to root for in a small town romance. Caveat, when you think about the people in it, they're all white. And,
Oh, yeah, they are.
and so what does it look like when the protagonists are Black or brown, though, when they are people of color? The themes are the same, but the demons of the past, unfortunately, could come in the shape of microaggressions,
Come on.
could come in the shape of a race crime, could come in the shape of a villain that wants to gentrify a neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so then that becomes an uncomfortable read because our experiences are not the standard. Because the way that we've trained ourselves, and in a lot of ways publishing has trained us, is to believe that the standard, the baseline for what the human experience is, it's something that has nothing to do with the ways that people of color and their identities intersect.
Yep.
So, I mean, a great example of this for me is After Hours on Milagro Street, which I think that by Angelina Lopez, which I think is probably one of the best contemporary series to have come out in the last 10 years.
Juicy.
It is phenomenal. And so it is a small town romance. It's set in Freedom, Kansas. I did not know a lot about Kansas before I read that book, to be honest, because I am from the Dominican Republic and I have only lived in New York State since I've been in this country. And so I didn't know a lot about it, but the protagonist is a Mexican American woman who is from this town, who comes home and begin to grapple with, again, some childhood trauma. She's been estranged from her family, who are all Mexican, who have been there for generations. And she's there to kind of untangle a mystery and to save this building that her grandmother has had a bar type of neighborhood watering hole for many years. And this romance is phenomenal. It is sexy. It is juicy. This heroine is outstanding. The hero is 7 feet tall and so swoony. And Angelina, on top of delivering us a truly outstanding romance, also delves into the history of Mexican Americans in Kansas, which I had no idea that Mexican Americans built the railway in the Midwest. I didn't know that. And she talks about the way that those Mexican Americans were treated, the things that the, city government did to discriminate, to keep them out, and how they've gentrified the neighborhoods that had been historically Mexican American in that town. Really, the villain is white supremacy in this book. And to me, that book should have been honestly, one of the most popular books of last year. And yet it wasn't. And I think it's because she was touching too many pain points for the average reader who just does not have the proficiency to read that kind of book, a book delving with those types of issues.
And that's actually the danger. That's the danger. You touched on it right on the nose of classifying these stories written by an amazing story like that as an issue book, because what it does is diminish their universality and dismiss that incredibly rich narrative that enriches the small town. It actually makes the story of the small town better, right? And the idea of books that are about social justice and race and exploring the human experience and all of its complexity as somehow too political or not interesting, you actually miss an incredible richness of experience. Because just like After Hours on Milagro Street, they're about love, they're about heartbreak, family, identity. And these are themes that resonate with readers of all backgrounds.
Yeah. And I think it's learning, again, it's developing the ability to read something and not be centered. And I think that's really hard for readers who have not had to do that for their whole lives. For us,
I need a reggae air horn. Whoa, 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 whoa. Like, that is such a key moment. Like, that is a skill to read something and not be centered. Wow.
yeah, and I think that is partly what is so hard for a lot of readers, and that's what it makes it political for them, because I think there's just a long history in American culture and American society of teaching us that being political is somehow being un-American. And what it means by that is that, like, if you support the status quo, you're patriotic. And if you don't, if you say, actually, these systems are not working for a lot of people and we need to change them, and that means that, like, the playing field is going to have to look a little different, then that is just being, un-American in some way, because you're saying things are not perfect already as they are. And with books like this, which is saying, I'm going to give you a look at a small town in America, with Mexican Americans who love where they're from, it's just that place sometimes has not loved them back. And how they have learned to still thrive in that environment is not an indictment on your own whiteness, but perhaps giving you a different way to perceive what a small town could be if it's explored from a different lens.
Exactly. This is a non-romance rec, but one of the authors who does this so well, small southern town detective, S.A. Crosby. His detectives are reluctant heroes. They're great. It's absolutely out of the kind of hero's journey. It's very Americana, right? But these are Black heroes in the South who are pushing against a system that is oftentimes against Black folk, but against the poor as well, or against other types of individuals, right? That particular detective can represent. And I'm saying this because reading those small town stories, it completely enchanted those spaces for me all over again, right? And fill those with spaces that are not all about trauma, that are about mystery and about cover-ups, and right out of John Grisham gripping novels of political intrigue.
I co-signed that recommendation. I have not read his latest, but, like, his last two have been, like, one of my favorite books of the year when I've read them. He is a phenomenal, and again, it's just like, Ruby Lang, who is one of my favorite authors, and I did a piece a few years ago about just, like, diversity in romance, and she said something. I talked to a few authors, and she said something to me that I have thought about almost every day since she said it to me, and that for the reader who is not used to reading outside their experience, when they read diverse romance, they're not just reading the world building within the novel, but we as authors are world building for them and making their world bigger.
I love that.
And I think about that all the time, because even as I was saying before, I didn't know a lot about the Midwest. And my perception of the Midwest was a very white place. And yet with Angelina's series, I've learned that when I think about Mexican Americans, I think about the South, which was Mexico. But when I think about the Midwest, I never think about Mexican Americans, and yet there's, like, they've been there for generations and generations. And so that to me is one of the beauty of reading diversely, and the work it can do in the reader of perceiving the world around them differently. Speaking of things that can resonate to readers of all backgrounds, a perfect example that is canon in romance, and for many of us, a comfort read, It's one of, I mean, it's a classic. It's a classic upon a classic. The movie is a classic. The show is a classic.
No, the book is a classic. Everything's a classic.
It's Pride and Prejudice. So
another reggae air horn.
Exactly. Jane Austen, our girl,
Yes.
one of the OGs. And when we think of Pride and Prejudice now, we hardly think of it as a text that in its time was radical and political to the extreme. The idea that a woman, a young woman, unmarried young woman of a family that is not in the best financial position,
to say the least,
that has to marry off 5 daughters, would rebel against a man with so much power that she would reject the idea that you can't marry for love, to reject, forgo, say no to security because she's aiming for happiness.
Not once, but twice. If you think about her creepy cousin.
About super creepy Collins with the potatoes, although that's just in the movies. And then to literally play in the face of the patriarchy and not end up dead, not end up in a super unhappy, possibly violent marriage, but living in the castle at Pemberley.
Yes, ma'am. Lizzie secured the bag.
In the crib.
She got the crib.
So please talk to me about that, because one of the things that like I want to talk about is the idea that for that story to be told, the story of Lizzie and Darcy to be told from the lens of a Black woman or a brown woman, that you would have to depart from the source, from the text.
Oh, this is so juicy. So I feel like I've read every single retelling of Pride and Prejudice for this reason. And a lot of things that people think is that when you write a story like this, in order for an Asian male lead and a Black woman to kind of make sense in Pride and Prejudice, like so many things have to be taken away. A lot of people were, when they read the book, they're like, wow, this is pretty close to the original. And I was like, yeah, that's actually quite on purpose, right? Because when you think about putting these individuals, this Black woman's perspective, seeing injustice in her neighborhood, seeing something gone wrong in her neighborhood, seeing an individual who imagines himself above them in her neighborhood, and her having the gall to stand up to someone who has leagues and leagues more agency and power than her, to say no, and to continue to say no in front of everyone, was still a political move. And the reason why I feel like personally, you can't really retell Jane Austen without it being in some way political. I think you do a disservice to Jane Austen to rewrite it and, make the characters really innocuous and not really struggling against some societal barrier. It has to be radical. Elizabeth has to make a radical choice in order for Pride and Prejudice to be Pride and Prejudice. And I think in the context of a Black woman in Southeast DC, who was just evicted from her home with absolutely no agency, but a lot of ideas, for her to actively go up against essentially the brick wall of money and gentrification in DC, is outrageous. It's outrageous in the way that someone would read Pride and Prejudice during that time and turn the pages with their mouth agape at what Elizabeth Bennet was doing, right? The extent to which Lisa in Pride and Protest is willing to put herself out and put her neck out and really kind of almost be kind of tarred and feathered socially for what she believes in. I think is still trying to be attentive to kind of the radicalness of that original text. And I do think that Jane Austen, in all of her books, she was always concerned about like who had the money, who has the power, how does this person get power? Is marriage the best way? And if marriage is the best way, how does this person without power attain that power? right? So she was always attentive to relationships, power, dynamics, marriage, patriarchy. She was always on it. And I think right now, when we turn on Pride and Prejudice, like we're eating ice cream, maybe our boyfriend's broken up with us, and and like it's background music. It's fluff almost. It's seen as completely innocuous. And I wonder if Jane Austen would just kind of walked in today, she'd be like, were you guys not aware that that this was crazy at the time? So yeah, the idea that now has floated into the kind of everyday imaginary is kind of on purpose. You take a novel, you take a book that's in the white imaginary, right, as an innocuous thing, and then you sneak that in like a Trojan horse, and you tell a Black story, and there we are doing that thing of kind of opening up people's experiences. I had a person in a book club talk to me about having to Google a twist out, and saying, "Oh, her hair was in some way. I just knew that she was really proud of it, but I ended up having to Google a twist out." And I'm like, "That is the work." Do you know what I mean? That's the work, right? Open your mind, and now you know that that's a style that someone can be proud of, right?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think part of what I think is important about your book, and I think other retellings that I've read, like one of my favorite retellings is Aisha at Last, which
That's my favorite. That's my absolute favorite. And I wrote one. Aisha at Last is the best to me.
is phenomenal. But I think part of what I think is dangerous, and I said that to you earlier, it's just like the language that we use around retellings of the implication that a Black woman or a Muslim woman would have to reimagine the story for it to be able to be told from the perspective of a Black woman or a South Asian Muslim woman, implies that like the universality and the things that make sense about Pride and Prejudice with its white characters wouldn't somehow apply to a story being told about like, a Black woman in DC in 2022 that is just like fighting against like capitalism and the patriarchy. And I think that to me is part of where like, no, let's make this sort of work even in our language of like not othering those stories, which are actually very faithful to the original text.
Yeah.
And in the really important themes and the places where Jane Austen was, as they say, putting her foot in it,
Mm-hmm.
are very much in tune, because again, like the fight of a woman standing up for herself and what she believes in the face of the patriarchy. And that hero that represents all the things that confine us, needing to see the error of his ways and needing to humble himself because love has come, and it has come in the shape and form of someone who is putting a mirror up to him and telling him the way you've been doing it is not okay.
Yeah.
And now you have to change your whole entire life and give a lot of your money away and go and save my sister because she's crazy.
Go and save my sister because she cray. Because she out there for the streets.
Exactly. And okay, you might have been right about Wickham, but I was right about everything else.
Yes. What you're talking about is like this kind of like ghettoization of the particular, or this sense that this experience, this Asian American experience, this Black American experience, this Latinx experience is particular, and that these white experiences are universal, right? So, and like that's the way that I think these stories that are extremely universal get put into this like multicultural issues, and it's just like a romance. My book is labeled in like Amazon under multicultural issues, like I guess, right? I guess it's an issue, right? But like that's that ghettoization, right, of what people can imagine. Oh, this is a very particular experience that no one can relate to, but this experience of Pride and Prejudice is universal and everyone can relate to it.
And that's like I mean, it's not cute, but it's understandable perhaps for a white reader to really need to make for themselves that like make that difference, or like make those two different things. Like there's Pride and Prejudice, and then there's the retellings by people of color. But it's not cute for us, Black and brown people, and specifically for readers. It is vital for us to not fall into the trap of we won't be able to enjoy something that is for us and by us.
Come on.
Because what we're actually saying by saying I can't read the stories that are about people like me. I'm going to read the stories that are about worlds that don't even envision a space for me, is that we're resigning ourselves to something that, like, in a way, kind of like confirms that we can't have that happiness in the real world.
Adriana, you've touched on the question that I have for you that I kept racking my brain and like watching all of these TikToks, bringing it back to the beginning. This was a Black woman, right?
Yes.
Who said, I can't read Black stories. I want white stories. This is a Black woman. And honestly, she's probably not the only Black woman who feels like she can only read Black stories. Like what are we eating, right? What food and poison are we eating? And like what are we telling ourselves by saying this is the type of story that resonates and connects with me, and this one doesn't? Are writers not serving Black women? I mean, what do you think?
No, I mean, I think it's like it's that we bought into this idea that an authentic, a true to life representation of Blackness, of brown, Latino, indigenous person is always so painful that it cannot be legitimately a romance. Like that's like part of it. Like that's the trap. We're delegitimizing the fact that the stories that you and I are writing are possible for us.
Mm.
And that is tragic for us. Because it's true that perhaps you're reading a book that has no allusions to systemic oppression, where your protagonist has no contact with racism or with any kind of violence, systemic violence, but at the same time, it's kind of saying I'm gonna settle for never being the main character.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or having to reimagine myself as a white woman, which cannot be us.
Yeah. It's sad. Like I'm like
It is sad.
it's sad. I'm thinking of this novel that I read. Speaking of just like what is normalization and understanding yourself and your body to be outside of the standard deviation, and how powerful it is once you are understood in your own context. A novel called Counterfeit by Kristen Chen. And she is an American Chinese woman, and she travels to China. And the one thing that she marvels at is how the world fits her again. How she goes into a shoe shop and the shoes slip right on, and the guardrails are right at her hand length, and just like it was a world made for her. And it was this interesting. I'll remember this for a while, because it is that feeling that you feel that makes you realize that you are not outside of some standard deviation. As a Black woman, when you go into buy jeans, and you know that automatically it's going to have that gap in the back, and you think that's how jeans fit, right? Until you go and get a dress made from a Ghanaian dressmaker, and you're like, oh dear dear God, this was made for me.
That flap,
right?
that flap goes right up to the small of my back. Like it's not just freewheeling on like by my butt.
Exactly. Exactly. But there's this moment where you're situated in in the clothes of your making, right? In the shoes of your making. And you have to look around and say, this fits me. This is where I am. And I think for some of those Black readers, they are jumping to put jeans on. Do you know what I mean? And they are struggling with that back gap. And they think that is the way that jeans are supposed to fit.
Yes.
Right? Sorry for the extended metaphor, but you know what I mean?
And I mean, again, like why do we write these books? Because we were hungry, starving, thirsting for books that we could read that spoke to us at that level, at the you are jumping to put your jeans on and you feel by pain. You know how it is to go into like a pharmacy and then be confronted with nothing but Head and Shoulders, and you're like, I can't buy any of this. I can't put anything of this on my hair.
That
Or a heroine that wears a bonnet to bed. Like shea butter. I don't know, so many things that are just particular, unique to us, and that
yeah.
we deserve to read about in the romance that we read.
In writing Pride and Protest, I fought to keep this scene in. It was like not even conducive to the plot. But there's just this one scene of Lisa putting on a yaki ponytail and talking with her sister. She's trying to decide on what ponytail to wear. She's just shifting through ponytails, and Janae's like, no, not that one. Yes, that one. And it's like this moment where she's putting on hair, right? In the way that people do when they're getting ready to go somewhere. And like styling their hair up and adding that additional like yaki ponytail to get the vibe or whatever that they're trying to get. It was such a small like moment. And in the editing process, I fought for that because I said, no, there's a fundamental getting readiness of like putting on a slick ponytail for a Black, you know what I mean? Making a slick ponytail and putting on that whatever poop in the back. That's an experience. And I want that to be part of Lisa getting ready.
Yes. And I mean, and there's so many examples like in our books of moments like that I in On the Hustle, which was my last contemporary, like I had multiple people have like highlighted this conversation that the hero who is Dominican and the heroine have, where he admits that he doesn't like plantains, and
God, I remember that.
And she freaks out. She's like, can you even say that? Like, can you even say that out loud? And so many Dominican readers have been like, oh my God, I hate plantains. I don't. I love plantains, Mom. But it's that piece of, it's such a unique thing to us, like as Caribbean people, like plantains are such a central part of our diet, of our nutrition, of what like keeps us moving. And to not like it is almost like sacrilege. And so again, like we deserve to be in a book where the strap is just where we need it to be. Like if it's just right there.
I love it.
Where it's accessible to us at a granular level. We deserve that. We deserve that. And I think we've been taught to have to just like settle for something that only offers us like glimpses of us, of what we could be.
Welcome to 8:30, a segment in the Unbound Podcast where we ask every author the same questions and get wildly different answers. It's time for 8:30 with Regina Black. Regina Black is a former civil litigator, current law school administrator, and lifelong romance reader who has always been passionate about the depiction of Black women in popular culture. She currently resides in Little Rock, Arkansas. Her latest work, The Art of Scandal, if you've been living under a rock, is propulsive, twisty, turny, a sexy story of a Black trophy wife who just found out her politician husband is cheating. They strike a deal, and now she has a million reasons to stay a good wife. But that was before she met Nathan.
And it has just been announced that it's been optioned for a television show. And I have to say personally, like from the first chapter, when I was reading that book, I listened to the audio. I was like, this needs to be a show. So I am glad that the universe heard
Made
me,
for TV.
and it will now be on my television sometime, hopefully in the not too far future.
Fingers, yeah.
Manifest it, sis.
Yes. No, I love that because everyone reads the book and they go, oh, this will make a good TV show. And this book was literally inspired by my love of those type of TV shows. So it's just this circle. It's perfect.
Regina Black, what if I told you you're in the right place?
Yes, because we're going to talk about
it.
We're
going to get into it. We're going to get into it.
Okay.
So first of all, welcome to Unbound, and thank you so much for chatting with us. And my first question is a doozy, but I think you can handle it. Is romance political?
Yes, absolutely. I think it is. And I think it's political in the fact that it's political in who we write those stories about, because these are stories that inherently center joy, and who you decide is deserving of that happily ever after or that happily for now is very political, even though we often don't even think about it. So who gets those stories? Why do we choose those people is a reflection of our capacity for empathy. What are our values? What are important? It just says a lot about us, with that, like who we decide should be centered in those type of stories. And particularly for people of color, for Black women in particular, one of the things about our stories most often is that they tend to center like our trauma and our struggle and things like that. And when you put a Black woman in this situation where you're actually centering her, her living instead of her struggle, that's an inherently political statement that you're making when you center her in a story like that.
Yes.
I think also part of it is also like how big your world is, right? Like it really gives a sense of your sense of the world. I have another question for you.
Yeah.
And that is, if you can remember the first romance you read.
I wish I could. I cannot. And this is why I have a reason, because I came into romance back when Harlequin category romances were pretty much the primary contemporary romance out there. And they would put out so many, and I would just eat them like candy. Like literally go to the library. They had that little thing, that stand that rotated, and like all the new ones would come, and I just check them all out, and then I take them home, read them all, bring them back, check them all out. Like I just gobbled them up. And then I used to read those, and then historicals. And so I just read so many romances growing up that I can remember certain books that made an impression on me, but like the absolute first one, I would say that's probably like fifth grade-ish, something like around that time. So I'm going to amend.
Can you remember? Because I have a similar situation where I can't remember exactly. Like, I remember a lot of different things I read, but I do have one that I remember that book and reading it and being like, and just because it was like, I was like 12, hormones, like my body was doing. And that was Untamed by Elizabeth Lowell. It's like a Viking. Okay. He shows up unconscious at her. No, he's like some kind of big man. And he shows up like unconscious, and then she like rubs oils on him to like bring him out of the coma. And like I have that like memory of like reading of this woman like trying to bring this man out of a coma with oil. So do you remember a book from like that time of your life that it's like imprinted?
Yes. It would probably be For All the Right Reasons by Elaine Kaufman. I read that book. So the premise of that book is there are these two brothers and there are these two sisters that grew up together. One of the sister, the mousy one, because there's always a mousy one that's gorgeous. Is in love with the older brother, who is like your alpha kind of.
I'm already in.
Yes. But he does not know this. And he is in love with the pretty sister who is blonde and perfect and all that kind of stuff. Well, he goes off to make his fortune and gets drunk one night and writes a letter to the sister he's in love with, asking her to marry him. Only he mistakenly puts the wrong sister's name in the letter. And so the wrong sister that has been in love with him all this time gets on a train or a boat, I can't remember, and comes thinking she's marrying the man she loves. The guy that got drunk, his brother was actually in love with the mousy sister, finds out what he did, and grabs his brother and is like, "You're going to marry
I am
her."
unwell.
Like, absolutely not. I mean, it is.
Harlequin, man.
That book, like, I was like, what? Like, it's phenomenal. Now, I haven't read it in a lot of years, but I will never forget that book and that setup, and it's messy, and based on the stuff I like to read and write, I think it really imprinted on me early. Like, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. For all the right reasons by Lane Kaufman.
Nobody does mess like a good Harlequin category. And the plot is tight. It's like a straight shot.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
It's so good.
Okay, that seemed like a book that was full of compelling tropes. The question that I have for you, I mean, we've had trope conversations, but is there a romance trope that you love that doesn't actually work well IRL, like in real life?
Okay, I have two. I'm not going to say enemies to lovers because I know that's what you think I was going to say. I'm not going to say that. That's an ongoing conversation. I would say opposites attract. Mm-hmm. I just don't buy that. I think in real life, even people who think they're opposites have commonalities that make their relationships work. So every time I see opposites attract, I'm like, this is cute at first, but wait a while.
Right.
So I don't think you'll ever see me writing I could read an opposite attracts romance and like it, but I always kind of side-eye the longevity of that because I'm like, it's cute when you're attracted to somebody, but when you're mad at them, it's why you break up. The other thing is love triangles. I just don't think work in real life. I'm like, watch Love is Blind and you'll see what happens in real life love triangles. So no, that does not work in real life. No.
I love those.
I concur on all your points because opposites attract is always like, yeah, but wait until that person starts embarrassing you in front of your friends. Like it's cute and cutery, but like you said, I think extrovert introvert is not so much opposites attract. It's just like how you socialize is different, but yeah.
But it's always going to be a source of conflict. Yeah. Like I know people who are like spouses, like have that introvert extrovert marriage and they're happy. But if they argue about something, it has to do with their differences. Yeah. Right. And so when I read a book and it's like, oh, they're the complete opposites, but they work because he gives her what she needs. I'm like, people don't work that way. No. Like, we go down like, my husband has a lot of opposite qualities that I have, and we do balance each other out, but it's compromise. It's not like, oh, he makes me more like him. That's not what happens.
Right.
What happens is it forces you to not dig so deep, like dig your heels in so deep where you are. But that's about it. So
yeah.
I love it. And I mean, it's one of those things, right? Where like, we're writing the books and we're like, these people in real life,
would they make it?
Will they make it? But they make it in our books and that's what matters.
You know what?
They do.
That is what matters. My husband is a 6'4", very lean former athlete. We couldn't be more opposite. I have only lifted books to my face. You know what I mean? but the narrative oftentimes of how people describe their relationships is still wrapped up in those. Like they'll be like married 50 years and they'll just like, oh, those we're complete opposites. Like people still talk about themselves like that, you know?
But you also, it's like even people that say we're complete opposites, there's some commonalities in like how they view the world and values. That is why they lasted 50 years.
Absolutely. So. Agreed. Okay, now moving into more of a pop culture part of the conversation. So we wanted to know, what TV show or movie would you compare your novel to? And that's a loaded question in this instance, because people are going to have opinions.
So I want to do two. So I want to do the one that I think most people would compare it to, and the one that mentally I compare it to. I think most people compare my book to Scandal, the show Scandal, because it has those commonalities. It's like in the DC area, it's about politics. It's about like people, power brokers, and things like that. And
interracial marriage.
Interracial marriage, relationships, things like that, like multicultural type, environment. So there's
Scandals in the title.
It's right there on the label. So I absolutely think that there are a lot of similarities there. And I think part of that, when people read my book and they think of that show, is because Shonda Rhimes right now is kind of the queen of the primetime soap opera, even though a lot of people don't call her shows soap operas. That's absolutely what they are. And my book was conceived through my love of soap operas. So that doesn't surprise me whatsoever. The show that I often think about is The Good Wife, because of the themes inherent in that. There is a scene at the beginning of The Good Wife that I feel like was the energy that I wanted to bring to the beginning of Scandal. And the first scene of The Good Wife is when, he's giving the speech about his affair, and they walk back into this room and she doesn't say anything. She just has that look on her face, and he kind of looks at her like he's like gonna talk to her, and she just slaps him. And that scene, the clip is on YouTube. I'm like, this is the energy that I wanted to bring into the beginnings, which is why you get, Rachel handling that news with that anger that's coming out, instead of the heartbreak I think a lot of people would have expected.
Yes.
So
yeah. I mean, to that end, when you talk about what people expected, we're not in charge of how people read our work.
Right.
But what do you think has been the biggest misunderstanding of your work so far, now that it's live and in the world?
That it's not a romance book.
Explain.
What so
I love Adriana's face. It just was such a journey. She's like, and what? How the
Yeah. Okay. So I've heard that a lot of people have said that about my book. And I was taken aback, because as someone who loves romance, I've been reading it all my life. That came into it years and years ago. When I sat down to write this book, I was like, okay, I'm going to write a romance book. And it has the features that I've always associated with romance books. Like the main core plot is that relationship is driving things forward. It's dual point of view. I'm not saying that romances have to be dual point of view, but dual point of view is typically kind of a big marker of romance. I always say, if you look at in the film arena, rom-coms follow both characters. You will have scenes with the man by himself and his subplot and his story, and vice versa for the woman. And so that's what we typically associate with romance on the screen. That's what I associate with it in books. That is what this is. And it has a happy ending. They end up together. To me, it's absolutely a romance. I never thought of it as anything else. I even when it was acquired, it was something I very strongly articulate to my agent, to the editor, like, this is a romance book. So that has always kind of taken me back. And it also makes me think about, okay, what about this book makes people not align it, like not put it in that genre? So, and, I have thoughts, but that it's interesting.
For those of you who were listening and didn't hear me and Adriana's faces, we just made the same face of what would make someone see this, Black woman having what they consider atypical experience and suddenly move it into a different category of reading.
I'm just befuddled, to be honest. Like, my face has been hanging open, my mouth has been hanging open now for like the last 5 minutes. It's interesting to me, and I think it's like, first of all, I think because it centers a Latino man and a Black woman. I think it's a non-traditional pairing because he's younger. She's a woman who's like, her life is in turmoil. She's a little messy, and I think that to me is, and I think it's the timeline that we're now in romance, where like a lot of what you see is like these power dynamics where like it's a very strong, like a billionaire coming to kind of rescue this younger kind of ingenue. Like if you like, that's the, but like if you think about, I don't know, Susan Elizabeth Phillips, like the kind of book she wrote, which is like not a messy woman, but a woman in a mess, like a smart, tenacious woman who's just in a messy situation, and like how she gets herself out of it and finds her strength. Like that's like a classic contemporary romance that has been popular for always, which usually with a bigger story where there's subplots and like it expands beyond just the romance and usually deals with other topics. Like, I think we just have to, I think people have like, if it can't be called a rom-com, like people get confused.
Yeah, I do think the expansive nature of the story, the fact that I wrote about like their worlds, maybe part of it. I also think, when I write male characters, I don't develop them as kind of wish fulfillment type men. Right. I develop them as men that have issues just like the women do. And so I think sometimes if you're searching for a particular romance experience that I've absolutely searched for before with books, I'm not giving you that. I'm giving you more like, okay, he's going through something. He's having this coming of age arc while she's going through something, and then they go through it together type romance. And that can feel different than what somebody might be used to.
There's also this aspect that is typically missing from a lot of people of color's work is, oftentimes the ability for the masses to self-insert, right? To see themselves and put themselves in a story and have oftentimes that female main character be a bit of a blank slate.
Yeah, it's highly specific, I think. Like both characters are very highly specific people, and their worlds are highly specific. I have people comment on like the supporting characters being extremely specific as something that kind of threw them, because I think there's like, oh, this person came, they're supposed to be super important because they feel like a highly specific character. And I'm like, no, that was me just trying to populate the town and make it feel authentic and real. So I all of it's kind of speculating, because at the end of the day, when I absolutely think of this as a romance book, and the book I'm working on now, I actually would understand that criticism a little bit more, because it does veer a little bit away from that, I guess, a more traditional structure. But this one, to me, it was like, to a point of view, the romance is the core story. It has a happy ending.
It has all the beats.
Romance.
It has all the
Yeah, it
beats
has
of
all the
romance.
beats. Yeah. Even the third act breakup.
Yep.
Which I love.
Which we're in this house, we are third act breakup evangelists.
I love a third act
You
breakup.
must
Make me
reintroduce
cry,
Gigi.
please.
You must.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is a good segue to our next question, which is about core story. So one thing that I think a lot about in my work, and Nikki and I have talked about before, is that no matter what you're writing, there's like a core story that you go back to again and again and again and again. So you already kind of touched upon that when you were talking about your protagonists and how you write them. So what would be your core story if you have one?
I would say it's like the way I write romance generally is always, it usually ends up being someone who needs self-love in order to be open to and vulnerable to loving someone else, to experiencing that connection that they're missing in their life. And so every time, usually when I sit down to write, I end up developing some character who has lost their way at some point. Maybe they had a passion or, something long ago that fulfilled them and then they lost it. And the journey we go on is them kind of coming back to themselves and learning how to love themselves in a way that kind of just facilitates this romance. And the romance is like the vehicle that brings them back to that sense of loving themselves, which is why I tend to write older characters. Like, I typically write characters in their 30s and up because that's a theme I'm just constantly drawn to. So.
I mean, that certainly comes through for Rachel in Art of Scandal. She really is coming back to herself, like in every physically, emotionally, professionally, in terms of her relationships. So it is like that journey of hers. I really loved her journey, and that core story is clear to me on that. Even for him too.
Yeah. For him, you can kind of see it's a little different because he is transitioning in my mind out of that kind of like early adult space where you still kind of have those childish qualities and view the world through that lens to a truly adult space, which makes falling in love with this older woman kind of the perfect vehicle for that, right?
Yes.
And which makes it very specific to falling for her. But he also kind of he reclaims that love he had for his dad. He reclaims kind of those feelings that he felt like he had to walk away from or suppress, and is able to kind of reclaim them, but see them more clearly as an adult. So, yeah.
And so thinking about your character's transition and then honestly kind of switching over to Regina's arc, right? Was there something that at the time in your writing career that you saw as a bad omen or bad sign or even a disaster that actually ended up working quite well for you?
Not writing for almost a decade. I used to write all the time, wrote a bunch of books, and then I just stopped when I got married. I had my daughter. And I just wasn't doing it. In the back of my mind, I was like, I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to come back to this. But, there was always this, can I come back to it? Have I just kind of not been writing so long that I can't do it anymore? And this was the book that brought me back to it, which is probably why those things were so prominent in the book. And I think it was actually a good thing because the stuff that I'm writing now and the voice I have now is because I got married and had my daughter and lived and had these experiences and failed and went through these big things. So it changed the way it gave me a vocabulary for what is love really, what does it mean to have your heart broken? What is loss really? That I don't think was present in my earlier work when I was younger. So.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it infuses it with like a different kind of wisdom and perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. There's no way the book that I have out there, I would never have been able to write that like 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow. So. Thoughtful pause.
Yes.
Yeah.
So our last question is, what is your very tiny personal metric, or like your most smallest personal metric for success as a writer?
This was hard for me. I have to think about this for a while. I think maybe when someone says they read my book in one sitting, like, or they couldn't put it down. Like,
sitting.
That is, I mean, it just lights up parts of my brain when someone says that, because it's just like, okay, I did my job. And I know that is the feeling that, you know, when I was young and I was just this voracious reader, was the absolute best feeling in the world. Like, I say when I was young, because now I got too much going on to finish a book in a day. But back when all I wanted to do was read, all I did was read, there was this high I used to get from like getting a book that just pulled me completely into that world. And I was like, I want nothing to disrupt my reading right now. Like, I want to stay here. And for me to have written a book that does that for someone is the absolute best feeling in the world.
Oh, I love that answer.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
That really is something. I love it when people are producing or productive about your work afterwards. Like, for me, like, it would bowl me over to see someone like drawing a, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, art, or doing some fiction, or doing, you know, one-act plays based on, you know what I mean? Just like whatever.
Yes.
Like the whole notion of like liking something so much, remixing it and producing it, like the very thing that I did, loving Jane Austen so much, and then redoing it, and then having someone produce that. Man.
Yeah. Please write fan fiction about the citizens of Oasis Springs. I love it. Post it on AO3. Like, go nuts. That would make my
don't tempt me, okay?
Oh man,
I have some filthy ideas.
Yes, go for it. And send it directly to me, please.
Please do it. I loved your answer, because it is true. Like, as a reader, that's like an incomparable feeling and experience when there's a book that just won't let you go, that you just can't walk away from it. You can't stop listening. You can't stop thinking about it until you get back to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. And just the idea, like, oh, you wrote something that someone has that experience with, is just like, there's nothing. There's nothing. So that's so special.
And before we go, Regina, can you tell us a little bit about what you are noodling on right now?
I am currently working on my second book that will be released by Grand Central. It's planned to be released in 2025. And it is called August Lane, and it is a second chance romance about a Black country singer who is a one-hit wonder, and lied about singing his most famous song. And he gets a chance at redemption, but in order to take that chance, he has to return to his hometown, small town Arkansas, where the woman who actually wrote his song currently lives. And she is not too enthused about his return.
So, it's giving what ought be gave.
And it is called...
It's giving what ought be
Yes, it is called...
It is... I had to stand up straight when I read that announcement.
Yeah. It's I think of it, I've started to think of it a little bit like A Star is Born with Black people, and with a hint of kind of like 7 Days in June type second chances, dual timeline, dual point of view. So,
reclaiming Black country, reenchanting the South. You are doing it in this second book.
Yes.
Wow. Look at us. Look at our timing. Okay, did we do it? Are we actually great at things? I think
And we actually time manage. Apparently, we can.
Look at what we did. Regina, thank you so much for coming on the show, for sharing these answers, these fantastic answers.
Thank you for being our very first.
Yes. Yay. I'm honored.
To be fair, part of what has, I think, impacted people's taste, like taste making in terms of romance, is that for a long time, publishing couldn't envision our stories as anything other than a struggle story. I mean, it is true. Like when you think about YA, for example, like the big books in YA have been books about like lessons about like what life is as a Black person in America, which are very important books. But we rarely get a book which is about like, you know, a brown girl falling in love over the summer with the two hot brothers that are next door. And so like that piece of it, I think, I mean, yes, anti-Blackness is also like a big piece of it, and people just not reaching for our books because of all these things that we have talked about. But I think there has been a training of like the reader to expect the fun read to be the read with the white people on the cover, and the lesson book to be the book with the brown people on the cover. And I think that's something that needs to be unlearned. And perhaps publishing hasn't done the work to reframe that piece of things.
That is absolutely on the nose. I wasn't really thinking about how much of our experience with traditional books is curated, and how much when we go, even right now, for a Black person who loves to read, how much extra work a Black reader or any person of color will have to do to find books that the voice is centered on them and the characters look like them and the experiences are like them at all. That it is actually an extra 2 or 3 steps, that it may be simpler to grab the book on the book talk table.
Yep. Because when it comes down to it, like pretty much everything else, romance has been a space that centers and reaffirms whiteness as a standard. And the only way to change that comes with creating consciousness around that. Like for people to realize, to have the ability to gut check and say, I've read 257 romances this year, and not a single one has been written by a person that's Black or brown. And the only Black or brown characters that I've read have been ones written by white women. And having the ability to say, I need to perhaps be more intentional about what I read because it's better for me. It's better for me. So yeah, like anything else in life, when you're living in a patriarchy, you have to be intentional about your feminism. When you're living in a white supremacy, you have to be intentional about like deconstructing that.
Yeah. I'm just literally doubling down on this. When you embrace diverse stories and recognize that politics is in all books, we become more informed and empathetic people, and better actual readers and better writers. If writing is your jam, I think we should challenge ourselves to always become better at our craft and better at the things that we enjoy, like reading. And you do that actually by spreading the love and reading broadly.
Be like Jane Austen. Lean into the political.
Like Jane Austen. Yes. So if you're listening out there, tell us your diverse reading villain origin story. What was the moment that you decided that you needed to read widely? And where are you on that journey? Hit us up, social media. Until next time, keep your hearts unbound.